Hi everyone, it's nice to see so many people are still here at the repeat presentation at the end of the day that overlaps with Java 1. I'm here to talk about innovation at Atlassian and especially about our 20% program which we've just put into place in the last year or so. And innovation is really important to a company like Atlassian. As I was walking out of the keynote, I checked Twitter because I've been manically reloading Twitter over the last couple of days. And somebody tweeted, just got out of the Atlassian keynote, how do they come up with all this cool stuff? And in general, the way that we come up with all this cool stuff is that Mike comes into the room and he talks very quickly and waves his arm. And then we explain to him why it's going to take about 5 times as long as he thinks to implement. But that's not the only place where ideas come from at Atlassian. So what I want to talk about is how we foster innovation from pretty much everyone in the company by putting some pretty simple things, but pretty fundamental things in place to give people time to work through ideas. And in case you haven't seen me speak today yet over the last 2 days, my name's Charles Miller. I'm the architect on the Confluence project. I've been at Atlassian about 5.5 years now, so I've sort of been around since sort of the very sort of early days. So I've seen a lot of how we develop software and how we sort of bring a product from Confluence 1.0, which is pretty much unrecognizable compared to Confluence 3, which just came out the other day. And so I want to start off by introducing you to a guy who I will call the product manager. Actually, this is a product manager, but this guy probably looks a bit better on the slide. And the product manager's job is to decide what goes in the next release of the product. And we've talked a lot about Agile over the last couple of days. And one of the things that came very early in the Agile movement was the idea of the developer bill of rights and the customer bill of rights. And the idea here was that in a software development process, you have the people whose responsibility it is to decide what the software needs to do, and you have the people whose responsibility it is to actually make that happen. And in the sort of the XP approach, the less those two sides interfere with each other, the better. Because you don't want your customer, especially since most XP work is done sort of on a contracting basis, you don't want the customer telling you how to write code or telling you that your estimates are wrong. And at the same time, the customer doesn't really want the software developers to listen to what they say and then develop something completely different. And so the idea is that this guy, the product manager, comes up with the ideas of what to implement, and these guys develop them, and we have some software. But at Atlassian, what we want is these guys, who is the entire Atlassian team, to come up with the ideas, because the company relies on getting ideas and putting them into products and coming up with things that everybody looks at and comes out of a keynote and says, hey, how do they keep coming up with that stuff? And so what we want to make sure is that these people have some kind of avenue to get their ideas back into the product. And now, sort of the traditional way that you can do that is you can take your really cool idea, you can give it to this guy, and he can put it back in the funnel with all the other ideas. And what happens is, because it goes through this process, at some point what comes out the other end kind of doesn't resemble what you wanted to put in the first place. And because of the way that product management works, product management is under a pretty serious set of constraints. They're judged on whether the next version of the software contains really complete marketable features. And so they're going to be, if not a little bit risk averse, then they're certainly going to focus on things that we all know how to do and how to implement and what the results are going to be. And some of the best innovations come from stuff where you don't actually know where it's going to go. So you really do need to give people the ability to experiment. And was anyone at Dave O'Flynn's Fedex presentation? The sort of greatest hits of Fedex? We have 2 people, about 4 actually. And so Dave talked about Fedex, and so for the people who weren't at that presentation, Fedex is a little competition that we put together very early in the life of the company. And what happens is that at Thursday lunchtime, everyone sits down at their desks and starts programming, and the competition runs until Friday afternoon, so there's pizza on Thursday evenings if you want to hang around. one or two people decide they're going to stay overnight because they have some really cool idea, but it's certainly not mandatory. And then on Friday afternoon, people sit down and we all get to present what we've done in front of the rest of the company, and everyone votes to see what the best project was. And what comes out of that is a lot of really, really good ideas. And it's a social event, so everyone gets together and we have some fun, we bond as a team. But what we really get out of it is a lot of really cool stuff. And if you saw some of the things that Dave O'Flynn presented in the previous presentation, that's really only the tip of the iceberg. Every time we have one of these things, we are utterly blown away by how many really good ideas are just lurking below the surface of the company waiting to come out, and how much of a crime it is that we don't have time to implement them all, and we really wish we did. The main problem with Fedex Day is that what comes out of it is the result of a day and a half of hacking. So you sit down, you work on something, you get no sleep on Thursday night, you come in, you get it ready for your demo, you are desperate to make sure that you don't break something 10 minutes before it's time to do your demo, but you inevitably do, and you panic even more. And you don't write tests, and you don't worry about writing good code. You just want something that looks good and that you can show to other people and have a bit of a demonstration of your idea. And so you get stuff that's utterly incomplete and usually requires, 10 times as much actual real work to make it product quality. And so we had Fedex Day for quite a while in the company, and it worked really well, but we really weren't happy with the amount of stuff that came out of Fedex and actually became polished enough to make it into a product. And so about a year ago, it was announced at one of the company all-hands meeting that we were going to do a bit of an experiment. And that experiment was to implement Google's idea of 20% time. And so it's pretty common knowledge that when you go to work for Google, every engineer gets to spend 20% of their time working on some project that they think is going to be worthwhile and that no one else has any input on. And that's often cited as the source of a lot of the innovation in Google. And so we thought this is a really good way to extend the Fedex idea and give people an opportunity to take these ideas, these really good ideas that we know people are having and that we can get them to demonstrate in one day, and actually give them the chance to build them into something that could actually make it into a product. And the more we looked, though, the more we found that we couldn't really find a great deal of information on how 20% actually worked in practice. On one hand, you had a lot of marketing material from people who wanted to recruit more engineers for Google, who said that 20% time was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Everyone rides ponies to work. But and on the other side, there were a very sparse number of blog posts and guys who had mates who worked at Google who had sort of an idea of how it might actually work in practice. But there wasn't a great deal of concrete information. So what we approached it as was an experiment, or a bit of a gamble. Mike, when he announced it as $1 million gamble, where we're putting this amount of developer effort to see what happens. And so what we decided to do was to run it as an experiment, to come up with some rules of how we were going to structure 20% time, and talk about what the results were, which is sort of one of the reasons I'm giving this presentation today. And so the first thing we did with 20% is we came up with some rules. And the rules were actually pretty simple. There are a couple of guidelines that are annoying things like, what is it actually 20% of? And we decided that it's 20% of the time that an engineer would normally spend developing. So time they would spend on support, or time they'd spend on holiday, or time they'd spend at the Atlassian Summit wouldn't count. Because otherwise, with all these other things on top, 20% would end up looking more like 30 or 40%, and suddenly you're losing an engineer. And so the next rule was another important one, which was that engineers should work on something that is at least related to Atlassian or Atlassian's products or the open source components that we use at Atlassian. And the reason for this is that it's really great to give people a completely free rein to work on anything they want, but unfortunately, because we're not a gigantic search engine company, we are, 200 guys in a company that started off in Sydney, Australia, we don't have the resources to back just any product that people come up with. I mean, we do have to make sure that the stuff that comes out of this at least fits into the general strategy of Atlassian. And we actually find that this isn't a rule we need to enforce very often because the kind of things that people want to do are generally focused around the products. And I'll talk about that a bit later. And the third rule, which is also something that I think contributed greatly to the success, even if it's not routinely enforced, is that every project that people start under 20% has certain requirements for getting support from other people in the company. So if you work on a 20% project for 5 working days, if you want to keep going with it, you have to find 3 other engineers in the company to get behind you and say, yeah, I think that's going really well and should continue. And if you go for more than 3 weeks on a project, then you have to get one of the founders, Mike or Scott, to sign off and say, yes, I think you should continue with that. And the idea behind this is twofold. The first is that it makes sure that people checkpoint their ideas with each other. What it makes sure of is that, after you've worked on something a couple of days, you have to show it to your mates. You have to, usually, a lot of the products will hold occasional presentations, not wearing lab coats, where people get together and they talk about the 20% project they're working on. And in doing so, they get feedback. People tell them, the UI could do some work, or that's a really good idea. Or sometimes they say, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but not really. And that brings us to the second important thing about this requirement to get backup, and that is that it encourages projects to fail early. And failing early is always a good thing in software. So and the important thing about Fedex is not Fedex, 20%. One of the important things about 20% is not to stigmatize failure. If you work on a 20% project and you work on it for a while and you find out at the end, wait a minute, that's never going to work, that's a really good result because you've spent some of your time determining that this idea you had isn't actually going to work. And that's a result, and that's an important result. And the other reason not to stigmatize failure is that innovation is about taking risks. And you cannot come up with great new ideas if you don't want to take the risk that some of those ideas are going to turn out to be duds. And so what you do is you put a structure in place to make sure that, okay, some of our ideas are going to be duds, but we're going to encourage people to try them out. And if they turn out to be bad, make sure they don't try and hang on to them. Make sure there's a lot of feedback and that everyone's kind of cool with just saying, well, okay, yeah, that was a bad idea, next. So we've talked about some of the ways that Fedex works. Next thing I want to talk about, not Fedex, I keep doing that, the ways that 20% works. The next thing I want to talk about is some of the challenges that we've faced in getting the 20% program up. And challenge number 1 is scheduling, and that's the big one. The big problem is that you've got to convince your project managers that they're going to lose sort of up to 20% of their developers. And the number is actually a lot less than 20%, but because not everyone takes 20% time. But still, it's something that has to be put into the schedule. And we find that it's a lot easier on larger teams to schedule 20% time because somebody on a team of 15 developers taking 1 day a week off to work on their pet project is not going to be noticed nearly as much as someone on a team of 3 developers where suddenly, in a week, this much less actually gets done, and it's a lot more noticeable when you've got a small number of developers, especially if somebody wants to take a whole week off to work on something. That's a lot harder to schedule on a small team than on a big team. Another bit of a challenge that we've come across is simple timekeeping. I can sort of put my hand up and say, yes, it's actually reasonably impossible to get developers to fill in timesheets because I don't, and I'm going to get in trouble tomorrow for that, and sorry, Soren. It's actually reasonably hard to track how much 20% time anyone has taken or what they've worked on without sort of chasing after them with a whip and making sure they actually report it. And that's just one of those things that is a practical matter that always gets come across. And the final challenge is, once you've come up with one of these things, getting it into the product. There always has to be a point at which these things are taken from being somebody's little pet 20% project and then moved into some kind of product or given some kind of support. It's great working on a Confluence plugin for a while and making it work, but as anyone here who's a plugin developer knows, you release the plugin and it's going to break in some future version of the product, or people are going to swamp you with bug reports or feature requests and start getting really annoyed when these things aren't implemented, and suddenly you've got to support this thing for the entire lifetime of the plugin. And so there has to be a point at which we commit as a company to getting that in the schedule. And that can often mean pushing something else out. So for example, in Confluence, the new PDF export stuff in Confluence 3.0 started off as Ryan Ackley's 20% time project. And he looked at the Confluence PDF code, thought, well, that sucks, and replaced it. And then we actually had to push some feature, which I don't know what it is. It was probably a really cool social feature. And we had to push one of those features out from Confluence 3.0 to Confluence 3.1 to fit the PDF export into. So it is going to make changes to your development schedule as well. And so I'm running a little bit over time because I totally mistimed this for the second time around. But so the sorts of things that people work on are often not huge things. And a lot of the things that people work on in their 20% time are the little things that niggle them as developers, like there's no way in support to find out if someone has changed a file in their Jira instance, or this particular API has always annoyed me, or this particular bug has always annoyed me. It's one of the surprises that came out of 20% is that we thought people were going to use it to work on big blue sky projects, but a lot of the time ends up going to really sort of small practical things that actually make the product better. So for every PDF export we have like a couple of bug fixes that go along with it, and it's sort of a really good balance that way. So thanks for listening to me for 17 minutes and 7 seconds, and thanks for coming to Summit, because it was awesome. Question.